Hey friend, I want you to take a deep breath with me right now. Just breathe in slowly and breathe out. If you clicked on this video, chances are your heart might be racing, your thoughts might be spinning like a washing machine on overdrive, or maybe there's this heavy weight sitting right on your chest that just won't go away. You're not alone in this feeling, and you're definitely in the right place. What if I told you that the very anxiety that brought you here tonight could actually become the doorway to the most profound peace you've ever experienced? That sounds almost too good to be true, doesn't it? But stick with me, because what I'm about to share with you isn't just another self-help technique or breathing exercise. This is about something far more powerful, far more lasting, and far more real than anything this world has to offer. My name is Sarah, and for the past 15 years, I've been walking alongside people who are drowning in anxiety, panic, and overwhelming fear. I've sat across from successful business executives who can't sleep at night, college students who can barely leave their dorm rooms, and parents who are paralyzed by worry about their children's futures. But here's what I've discovered in all those conversations, and here's what changed everything for me personally. There are promises that Jesus made specifically for moments like these. Promises that weren't meant to be pretty verses on coffee mugs, but actual lifelines for when your world feels like it's falling apart. Now, before you think this is going to be one of those videos where someone tells you to just pray about it or have more faith, let me stop you right there. What we're going to explore together goes so much deeper than surface-level religious advice. We're talking about encountering the actual person of Jesus, who looked at anxious, overwhelmed, broken people 2,000 years ago and gave them specific, concrete promises that still hold true today. Here's what we're going to uncover in the next few minutes together. First, I'm going to walk you through the 3 most powerful promises Jesus made specifically for anxiety. And I mean the kind of anxiety that keeps you up at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling. These aren't general encouragements. These are targeted surgical strikes against the very root of what's stealing your peace. Second, I'm going to show you exactly how to apply these promises when your anxiety is at its worst, because knowing about them intellectually and actually experiencing their power are 2 completely different things. And third, by the end of this video, you're going to have a toolkit that you can use tonight, tomorrow morning, or whenever that familiar knot starts forming in your stomach again. But here's the thing that makes this different from every other anxiety video you've probably watched. Most approaches try to manage anxiety or cope with it. What Jesus offers is something entirely different. He doesn't just want to help you manage your anxiety. He wants to replace it with something better, something that goes beyond just feeling calm. We're talking about a peace that literally doesn't make sense given your circumstances. A peace that can exist in the middle of the storm, not just after it passes. I know that might sound impossible right now, especially if you're in the thick of it. Maybe you've tried everything: therapy, medication, meditation apps, exercise, journaling, cutting out caffeine. And listen, some of those things can be really helpful. But if you're still here, still searching, still feeling like something is missing, then maybe you're ready to discover what you've been looking for all along. See, anxiety isn't just about what's happening in your mind or your body. It's about what's happening in your soul, and that's exactly where Jesus meets us. He doesn't stand at a distance shouting advice across the canyon of your pain. He steps right into the mess with you. He knows what it feels like when your thoughts race, when your chest gets tight, when the future feels like a black hole of uncertainty. Let me paint you a picture of what I mean. Imagine you're in a boat in the middle of a lake, and suddenly a storm hits. The waves are crashing over the sides, the wind is howling, and you're absolutely convinced you're about to go under. Now, most people would try to help you by shouting instructions from the shore. Just stay calm. Try to balance the boat. You've got this. But Jesus gets in the boat with you, and then he does something that changes everything. He speaks to the storm itself. That's exactly what we're going to explore together, not just how to survive the storm of anxiety, but how to experience Jesus speaking peace directly into your situation. And I'm not talking about some mystical, abstract concept. I'm talking about practical, applicable truth that you can grab onto when everything else feels like it's slipping away. Now, I need to be honest with you about something. The promises we're going to look at aren't magic formulas. They're not going to instantly make all your problems disappear or guarantee that you'll never feel anxious again. What they will do is give you an anchor that holds steady no matter how rough the waters get. They'll give you access to a peace that isn't dependent on your circumstances being perfect or your life being figured out. Think about it this way. When you're drowning, you don't need someone to explain the science of water displacement. You need someone to throw you a rope. That's exactly what Jesus' promises are. They're ropes thrown directly into the chaos of your anxiety, and they're strong enough to hold you no matter how deep you feel like you're sinking. But here's where it gets really interesting. These promises weren't given to people who had their lives together. They were given to people who were desperate, overwhelmed, and at the end of their rope. People who were facing impossible situations, uncertain futures, and circumstances that seemed hopeless. In other words, they were given to people exactly like you and me when anxiety has us in its grip. The first promise we're going to explore is one that Jesus gave to a group of his closest friends who were absolutely terrified about what the future held. They had just learned that he was leaving them, and everything they thought they knew about their lives was about to change. Sound familiar? It's the same promise he gives to us when we're lying awake at night, wondering how we're going to pay the bills, or when we're scrolling through news headlines that make the world seem like it's falling apart, or when we're waiting for test results that could change everything. The second promise was spoken to people who were so worried about their basic needs, food, clothing, shelter, that they couldn't think about anything else. Jesus looked at their anxiety about provision and security and gave them something that completely reframed how they thought about their needs and God's care for them. This isn't just about financial anxiety, though. This promise speaks to every form of worry about whether we'll have what we need, whether we'll be okay, whether we're going to make it through whatever we're facing. And the third promise? This one was given in the context of persecution, rejection, and suffering, to people who were facing situations that were genuinely dangerous and difficult. Jesus didn't minimize their circumstances or tell them everything was going to be easy. Instead, he gave them something more valuable than an easy life. He gave them an unshakable foundation that could withstand whatever came their way. Here's what I love about these promises. They're not theoretical. They're not philosophical concepts that sound nice, but don't actually help when you're having a panic attack at 2 a.m. These are battle-tested truths that have sustained people through wars, famines, persecution, loss, and every form of human suffering imaginable. They've been tested by millions of people over thousands of years, and they've never once failed. But, and this is crucial, these promises only work when we understand how to actually rest in them. And that's not as simple as it sounds. See, most of us have been taught to fight anxiety, to push through it, to overcome it with willpower and positive thinking. But what if I told you that the secret to experiencing Jesus' peace isn't about fighting harder, but about learning how to rest deeper? That might sound backwards, especially if you're someone who's used to solving problems through effort and determination. But anxiety often gets stronger the more we struggle against it. It's like quicksand. The more you thrash around trying to get out, the deeper you sink. But when you learn how to be still, how to stop struggling and start resting in something bigger than yourself, everything changes. This is where most people get stuck, and it's exactly what we're going to unlock together. Because knowing about God's promises intellectually and actually experiencing their power in your anxiety are two completely different things. One is information, the other is transformation. One leaves you still anxious but with more knowledge, the other leaves you with a peace that literally surpasses understanding. So how do we make that shift from information to transformation? How do we move from knowing about these promises to actually experiencing their power when our minds are spinning and our hearts are pounding? That's exactly what we need to unpack, because this is where the rubber meets the road. First, let me tell you what doesn't work. It doesn't work to just quote scripture at your anxiety like you're casting a spell. It doesn't work to plaster Bible verses on your bathroom mirror and hope they'll magically sink in while you're brushing your teeth. And it definitely doesn't work to beat yourself up for feeling anxious in the first place, thinking that somehow your anxiety means you don't have enough faith. I learned this the hard way. There was a season in my life when anxiety had me completely paralyzed. I'm talking full-blown panic attacks, insomnia that lasted for weeks, and this constant feeling like something terrible was about to happen. I knew all the right verses. I could quote them perfectly. But when 3 a.m. rolled around and my heart was racing like I'd just run a marathon, those verses felt like empty words floating around in my head with no power to actually change what I was experiencing. That's when I discovered something that changed everything. These promises aren't meant to be recited at our anxiety from a distance. They're meant to be inhabited. They're meant to become the environment we live in, the atmosphere we breathe, the foundation we stand on. There's a massive difference between knowing that Jesus said, "Do not let your hearts be troubled," and actually allowing those words to create a sanctuary of peace around your soul. Think of it like this. You can know everything about how a house is built, the foundation, the framing, the electrical work, the plumbing. You can study the blueprints, memorize the specifications, even teach a class on construction. But until you actually move in and make that house your home, all that knowledge is just academic. The promises of Jesus work the same way. They're not meant to be studied from the outside. They're meant to be moved into and lived from. But here's where it gets tricky, and this is something I wish someone had told me years ago. When you're in the middle of acute anxiety, when your nervous system is in full fight or flight mode, your brain literally cannot process information the same way it normally does. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for rational thinking and decision-making, goes offline. You're operating from your amygdala, the ancient part of your brain that's designed for survival, not for contemplating spiritual truths. This is why trying to reason your way out of anxiety rarely works. This is why positive thinking and affirmations often fall flat when you're in the thick of it. Your brain is in survival mode, and it's scanning for threats, not for encouragement. But here's what's beautiful about the way Jesus designed his promises. They don't require your prefrontal cortex to be functioning perfectly. They work at a level deeper than rational thought. When Jesus said, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you," he wasn't just offering a nice sentiment. He was releasing something into the spiritual atmosphere that transcends your current mental state. His peace isn't dependent on your ability to understand it, analyze it, or even believe it in the moment. It's like oxygen. It's there whether you're consciously aware of it or not, and your soul can breathe it in even when your mind is chaos. This is why the first step in resting in these promises isn't trying to understand them better or believe them harder. The first step is learning how to position yourself to receive what's already being offered. And that positioning isn't complicated, but it is completely different from how most of us have been taught to approach anxiety. Most anxiety management techniques focus on what you need to do. Breathe differently, think differently, behave differently. But resting in Jesus' promises starts with recognizing what's already been done. It starts with the radical idea that your peace doesn't depend on your performance, your circumstances, or even your current emotional state. It depends on something that happened 2,000 years ago and something that's happening right now, in this very moment, regardless of how you feel. Let me give you a picture that might help this make sense. Imagine you're in a soundproof room during a thunderstorm, Outside, there's lightning, thunder, torrential rain, the kind of storm that would normally have you on edge, maybe even frightened. But inside that room, you can't hear any of it. You might see flashes of light through the window. You might know intellectually that there's chaos happening outside, but it can't touch you. The storm is real, but it has no power over your experience because of where you're positioned. That's what it means to rest in the promises of Jesus. The storms of life, the job uncertainty, the health scares, the relationship problems, the financial stress, they might still be swirling around you. You're not pretending they don't exist or putting on a fake smile and acting like everything's fine. But you've found a place to position yourself where those storms can't determine your internal weather. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. That sounds great in theory, Sarah, but how do I actually get to that soundproof room when my anxiety is screaming so loud I can barely think straight? That's a fair question, and it's exactly what we're going to tackle next, because there are specific practical ways to move from where you are right now, maybe feeling overwhelmed, maybe feeling desperate, to that place of rest. The key is understanding that this isn't about suppressing your anxiety or pretending it's not there. It's about learning to hold your anxiety and Jesus' peace at the same time. Most of us think we have to choose one or the other. Either we're anxious or we're peaceful. But that's not how it works in real life. You can acknowledge that your heart is racing while simultaneously anchoring yourself in the truth that you're held by someone bigger than your current crisis. This is where the promises become practical rather than just inspirational. When Jesus said, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world," he wasn't minimizing the reality of trouble. He was acknowledging it and then pointing to something greater. He was saying, yes, the trouble is real, and yes, there's something more real than the trouble. That's the space we're learning to live in. The space where we can say, my anxiety is real, and God's peace is more real. My circumstances are challenging, and God's promises are more reliable than my circumstances. I don't know how this situation is going to work out, and I know who holds my future. This isn't denial or toxic positivity. This is what it looks like to live in the tension of being fully human and fully held by God. But learning to hold both realities requires a different kind of strength than what most of us are used to. It's not the strength that comes from gritting your teeth and pushing through. It's the strength that comes from sinking down deep into something solid and letting that foundation support you. It's less like building muscles at the gym and more like learning to float in water. It requires relaxation, not tension. This is probably the hardest thing for those of us who are used to being in control, used to fixing things, used to working hard to solve our problems. Everything in our culture tells us that if we're struggling with something, we need to try harder, do more, push through. But anxiety often gets worse under that kind of pressure. It's like trying to untangle a necklace by pulling harder on both ends. All you do is make the knot tighter. What if instead of trying to untangle the anxiety, you learned to rest in the middle of it? What if instead of waiting for the anxiety to go away before you can experience peace, you discovered that peace can coexist with uncertainty, calm can exist alongside concern, and rest can happen even when your circumstances are far from restful? This is where the promises of Jesus become revolutionary rather than just comforting. Because they don't promise to remove every storm from your life. They promise to be your anchor in the storm, your shelter in the chaos, your steady ground when everything else is shifting. And that, it turns out, is so much better than a life with no storms, because it means no storm can ever threaten what matters most. So let me take you deeper into what this actually looks like when the anxiety hits. Picture this. It's 2:47 a.m. and you're wide awake again. Your mind is doing that thing where it jumps from one worry to the next like a pinball machine on overdrive. What if I lose my job? What if something's wrong with my health? What if my kids aren't safe? What if? Your chest feels tight, your palms are sweaty, and you're Googling symptoms or worst-case scenarios for the third time this week. This is the moment when most well-meaning advice falls apart. This is when just think positive thoughts sounds like someone telling you to just flap your arms and fly. This is when everything happens for a reason feels like a slap in the face. And this is exactly when the promises of Jesus prove they're not just pretty words. They're lifelines thrown into the deepest waters of human experience. But here's what I need you to understand about these promises before we dive into them. They weren't spoken into perfect circumstances by someone who had never experienced real struggle. Every single promise we're about to explore came from Jesus during some of the most intense, difficult, and uncertain moments of his life and ministry. He spoke peace to people who were facing rejection, poverty, persecution, and death. He offered rest to people who were exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. The first promise I want to share with you comes from John chapter 14, and it was spoken on what might have been the most anxiety-inducing night in human history. Jesus had just told his closest friends that he was going to die, that one of them would betray him, that another would deny even knowing him. These men had given up everything to follow him, and now their entire world was about to collapse. Can you imagine the fear, the confusion, the absolute panic that must have been racing through their minds? And into that moment of maximum anxiety, Jesus spoke these words, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God. Believe also in me." Now, if you've heard this verse before, you might think, okay, that's nice, but how does that actually help when I'm spiraling? But stay with me, because there's something profound happening here that most people miss. Notice that Jesus didn't say, "Your hearts won't be troubled." He didn't promise that they wouldn't face difficult circumstances or feel the weight of uncertainty. Instead, he gave them a choice in the middle of the trouble. "Do not let your hearts be troubled" is an invitation to something deeper than positive thinking. It's an invitation to rest in his character and his promises even when everything around you feels chaotic. But here's the part that changes everything. Right after he says this, Jesus doesn't leave them hanging with just a nice sentiment. He gives them something concrete to anchor their souls to. "My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am." Do you see what he's doing? He's taking their anxiety about the future, about what's going to happen to them, about whether they'll be okay, about whether this whole thing has been a mistake, and he's anchoring it to something unshakable. He's saying, "I know the future looks terrifying right now, but I'm already there, preparing a place for you. Your security doesn't depend on what you can see or control. It depends on what I've already set in motion. This isn't just about heaven someday. This is about the reality that right now, in this moment, Jesus is actively working to prepare good things for you, even when you can't see it, even when everything looks like it's falling apart, even when your anxiety is telling you that disaster is just around the corner. He's preparing a place, not just in eternity, but in your circumstances, in your story, in your future. But how do you actually rest in that when your brain is convinced that catastrophe is imminent? This is where most people get stuck, and it's exactly where I got stuck for years. I would read that verse, I would try to believe it, but my anxiety would come back with all sorts of evidence for why I should be worried. But what about this situation? What about that possibility? What about all the things that could go wrong? Here's what I learned. Resting in this promise isn't about silencing those anxious thoughts. It's about learning to hear them and then choosing to anchor yourself to something deeper. It's like being in a boat during a storm. The waves are still crashing, the wind is still howling, but your boat is anchored to something on the ocean floor that can't be moved by what's happening on the surface. When those anxious thoughts start racing through your mind at 2:47 a.m., you don't have to pretend they're not there. You can acknowledge them and then say, "These fears feel very real right now, and Jesus is preparing a place for me. These circumstances look overwhelming, and He's already working in my future in ways I can't see. I don't know how this is going to work out, and I know who holds tomorrow." This isn't denial. This is what it looks like to live anchored to truth that goes deeper than your current emotional weather. And the beautiful thing is, the more you practice this, the more natural it becomes. Not because the anxious thoughts go away, but because you learn to hold them lightly instead of letting them hold you captive. The second promise builds on this foundation, but it addresses a different kind of anxiety. The anxiety about whether your needs will be met. This is the worry that keeps you up at night wondering how you're going to pay rent, whether you'll have enough for retirement, whether there will be enough resources for your children's futures. It's the anxiety that has you checking your bank account multiple times a day or lying awake, calculating and recalculating your budget. Jesus addressed this specific type of anxiety in Matthew chapter 6, and He did it in a way that's both profoundly practical and deeply spiritual. He said, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they?" Now I know what you might be thinking. That's all well and good, Jesus, but birds don't have mortgages. Birds don't have to pay for health insurance or college tuition or car repairs. And you're right. This isn't a promise that you can just quit planning, quit working, and expect manna to fall from heaven. But it is a promise about something much more foundational than your bank account. What Jesus is addressing here is the anxiety that comes from believing that your security depends entirely on what you can accumulate, control, and manage. He's pointing to a different kind of security, one that's based on your identity as someone who is deeply valued and cared for by the Creator of the universe. When he says you're much more valuable than the birds, he's not just giving you a pep talk, he's revealing a spiritual reality about your worth that exists independent of your circumstances. This promise isn't saying that financial stress isn't real or that practical concerns don't matter. What it's saying is that your ultimate security doesn't rest on those things. Your ultimate security rests on the fact that the God who keeps the entire universe running, who ensures that billions of birds find food every single day without worrying about it, has His attention on you. But again, how do you actually rest in this when the bills are piling up and the checking account is running low? How do you experience this promise when your anxiety is screaming that you're one emergency away from disaster? This is where the rubber meets the road, and this is where most people either break through to real peace or stay stuck in the cycle of worry. The key is understanding that resting in God's provision doesn't mean being passive about your responsibilities. It means carrying your responsibilities without being crushed by them. It means doing what you can while trusting God with what you can't. It means working hard and sleeping well, planning wisely, and holding those plans lightly. I think about a friend of mine who lost her job unexpectedly during a particularly difficult economic season. She had 2 young children, a mortgage, and about 3 months of savings. By every logical measure, she should have been consumed with anxiety. And don't get me wrong, she felt the weight of the situation. She wasn't pretending it wasn't scary. But I watched her navigate that season with a peace that honestly didn't make sense, given her circumstances. When I asked her how she was staying so calm, she said something I'll never forget. "I'm doing everything I can to find work and manage our resources wisely. But I've decided that my job is to be faithful with today and God's job is to handle tomorrow. I can't control whether I get hired, but I can control whether I trust that He sees us and He's going to take care of us. That's what it looks like to rest in this promise. It's not about having all the answers or knowing how everything is going to work out. It's about doing your part while trusting God with His part. It's about living from a place of security that goes deeper than your current bank balance. And here's what's remarkable about this approach. When you stop carrying the weight of things that are ultimately out of your control, you actually become more effective at handling the things that are within your control. Anxiety clouds your judgment, makes you reactive instead of responsive, and often leads to poor decisions made from a place of fear. But when you're anchored to the promise that God sees you and values you and is committed to your well-being, you can make decisions from a place of peace rather than panic. This doesn't mean you'll never face financial challenges or that following Jesus comes with a money-back guarantee. What it means is that your peace doesn't have to be held hostage by your circumstances. What it means is that you can face uncertain times with a confidence that isn't based on your ability to control outcomes, but on God's ability to be faithful to His promises. The third promise is perhaps the most powerful of all, because it speaks directly to those seasons when anxiety isn't just about future possibilities, but about current realities. When you're not just worried about what might happen, but you're actually walking through something genuinely difficult right now. This is the promise for when you're sitting in a doctor's office waiting for test results, when you're going through a divorce you never wanted, when you've lost someone you love, when the thing you feared most has actually happened. In John 16:33, Jesus said something that at first might not sound very comforting. In this world, you will have trouble. He didn't say you might have trouble, or you'll have trouble if you don't have enough faith. He said you will have trouble. It's guaranteed. It's part of the human experience. But then He said something that changes everything. But take heart, I have overcome the world. This might be the most honest and hope-filled promise in all of Scripture. Jesus doesn't minimize the reality of suffering or pretend that following Him means life will be easy. Instead, He acknowledges that trouble is real and then points to something more real than the trouble. He's saying, yes, you're going to face hard things, and I've already defeated everything that could ultimately harm you. When anxiety has you convinced that your current struggle is going to destroy you, this promise becomes your lifeline, because it's not saying that the struggle isn't real or that it doesn't matter. It's saying that the struggle, no matter how overwhelming it feels, is not the final word in your story. Jesus has overcome the world, not just the good parts of the world, but the broken parts, the painful parts, the parts that cause anxiety and fear and despair. But what does it actually mean that He has overcome the world? Because if you're like me, when you're in the thick of anxiety, when you're dealing with real problems that have real consequences, that can sound like a nice theological concept that doesn't translate into your 3 a.m. panic sessions. Let me tell you what I've discovered this means in the most practical, life-changing way possible. When Jesus says He has overcome the world, He's not talking about erasing difficulty from your life. He's talking about something far more powerful than that. He's talking about the fact that nothing you're facing has the final say over who you are or where your story is headed. The anxiety that feels like it's going to swallow you whole, overcome. The circumstances that seem impossible to navigate, overcome. The fear that whispers you're not going to make it through this, overcome. But here's where this gets really personal. And this is where my own story intersects with this promise in a way that changed everything for me. About 7 years ago, I was going through what I can only describe as the perfect storm of anxiety-inducing circumstances. My marriage was falling apart. My father had just been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's, and I'd been laid off from a job I loved during a time when positions in my field were nearly impossible to find. I remember sitting on my bathroom floor at 2 in the morning, having what felt like the 100th panic attack that month, and I was absolutely convinced that my life was over. Not dramatically over, but practically over. I felt like I was watching everything I had built crumble in real time, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The future looked like a black hole, and I couldn't imagine how any of it was going to work out. That's when this promise became more than just words on a page for me. Because in that moment, sitting on that cold tile floor with tears streaming down my face and my heart racing like it was trying to escape my chest, I had to make a choice. I could either believe that my circumstances were the ultimate reality, or I could believe that Jesus' victory was more ultimate than my current crisis. Now, let me be clear about something. This wasn't a moment of dramatic spiritual breakthrough where angels started singing and all my problems disappeared. This was messy and raw and honestly pretty desperate. I didn't feel peaceful. I didn't feel confident. What I felt was like I was drowning, and someone had thrown me a rope, and I had to decide whether to grab onto it or not. So I grabbed onto it. Not because I felt like it, but because I was out of other options. And what I discovered in that moment is that Jesus' promises don't require you to feel strong enough to believe them. They don't require you to have your emotions sorted out or your faith figured out. They just require you to be desperate enough to reach for them. Here's what started happening as I learned to anchor myself to this promise instead of to my circumstances. The circumstances didn't change immediately. My marriage still needed serious work, my dad's diagnosis was still heartbreaking, and I was still unemployed. But something in me changed. The circumstances stopped defining my internal weather. They were still real, they still mattered, but they weren't the boss of my peace anymore. It's like the difference between being in a boat that's being tossed around by every wave versus being in a boat that's anchored to something deep and solid. The waves are still there, the boat still moves, but there's something holding steady underneath that keeps you from being swept away. This is what it means to rest in the promise that Jesus has overcome the world. It means that when anxiety tries to convince you that your current struggle is going to defeat you, you can acknowledge the struggle and remember that it's already been defeated. When fear whispers that you're not going to make it through this, you can feel the fear and know that your making it through doesn't depend on your own strength. But let me get even more specific about how this works when you're in the middle of an anxiety spiral. Because understanding this intellectually and experiencing it when your nervous system is in overdrive are two completely different things. When your amygdala is fired up and your thoughts are racing and your chest is tight, you need more than just a good theological explanation. You need practical ways to move from where you are to where Jesus' peace is. The first thing I learned is that you don't have to wait until you feel peaceful to access Jesus' peace. This was revolutionary for me, because I had always thought that peace was a feeling, and if I wasn't feeling it, then I didn't have it. But what I discovered is that Jesus' peace is more like a radio station that's always broadcasting. Just because you're not tuned in doesn't mean it's not there. When anxiety is loud, it's like static that makes it hard to hear the signal. But the signal is still there. Your job isn't to get rid of all the static before you can access the peace. Your job is to tune into the peace in the middle of the static. And you do that not by trying harder to feel peaceful, but by choosing to rest in what's true about Jesus, even when your emotions are telling you something different. Let me give you a picture that might help this make sense. Imagine you're in a house during a thunderstorm and the power goes out. It's dark, it's loud, everything feels chaotic and uncertain. But you remember that you have a flashlight in the drawer next to you. Now, turning on that flashlight doesn't make the storm go away. The thunder is still thundering, the rain is still pounding, the wind is still howling, but suddenly you can see where you are, you can navigate your surroundings, and the storm loses its power to completely disorient you. That's what it's like when you learn to access Jesus' promises in the middle of anxiety. The anxious thoughts might still be there. The circumstances might still be challenging, but you can see where you are in relation to something bigger and more stable than the storm. So practically speaking, when anxiety hits, instead of trying to fight it or fix it or figure it out, try this instead. Acknowledge what you're feeling without judgment. I notice that I'm feeling really anxious right now. My chest is tight, my thoughts are racing, and I'm scared about what might happen. Don't try to talk yourself out of it or minimize it. Just notice it. Then, instead of trying to make the anxiety go away, choose to rest in what's true about Jesus in the middle of it. I'm feeling really anxious right now, and Jesus has overcome everything I'm worried about. I don't know how this situation is going to work out, and I know who holds the outcome. These feelings are very real, and God's love for me is more real than these feelings. This isn't about replacing your anxiety with positive thoughts. This is about learning to hold your anxiety and God's truth at the same time. It's about discovering that you don't have to choose between being honest about your struggle and being anchored to hope. You can be both anxious and held, both uncertain and secure, both overwhelmed and ultimately okay. The beautiful thing about this approach is that it actually gives your nervous system permission to calm down. When you stop fighting the anxiety and start resting in something bigger than it, your body begins to shift out of fight or flight mode. Not because you've convinced yourself that there's nothing to worry about, but because you've positioned yourself in a place of safety that exists independent of your circumstances. But here's where it gets even more interesting. As you practice this, and it is a practice, not a one-time fix, you start to notice something remarkable happening. The things that used to send you into a complete panic start losing their power over you. Not because you become careless or naive, but because you develop a different kind of confidence. A confidence that says, I don't know what's going to happen, but I know I'm going to be okay because I belong to someone who has already overcome anything that could ultimately harm me. This is what it looks like to live from a place of rest instead of a place of striving. Most of us have been taught to manage our anxiety by controlling our circumstances, planning for every contingency, working harder to prevent bad things from happening. But what if the secret to peace isn't about controlling your external world, but about resting in your identity as someone who is deeply loved and completely secure regardless of what your external world looks like? I think about Jesus sleeping in the back of a boat during a storm that had experienced fishermen convinced they were about to die. The disciples are panicking, bailing water, probably wondering if they made a terrible mistake by following this teacher. And Jesus is so at rest that he's sound asleep while the boat is being tossed around by waves. When they wake him up, he doesn't panic, he doesn't start helping them bail water or grab the oars. He speaks to the storm and it stops. But here's what I find most remarkable about this story. His peace wasn't dependent on the storm stopping. He was at peace in the middle of the storm before he did anything about it. That's the kind of peace he offers you. Not the peace that comes after all your problems are solved, but the peace that can exist in the middle of unsolved problems. Not the peace that comes from having your future figured out, but the peace that comes from knowing who holds your future. And this is where these promises start working together in the most beautiful way. When you know that Jesus has gone ahead to prepare a place for you, when you're anchored to the reality that you're valued and cared for by the Creator of the universe, when you're convinced that nothing you're facing has the final say over your story, something shifts in how you experience life. You stop living like your peace depends on everything going according to your plan. You stop carrying the weight of things that were never meant for you to carry. You stop being held hostage by what-if scenarios and worst-case possibilities. Not because you become careless, but because you become confident in something bigger than your ability to control outcomes. This is what it means to rest in the promises of Jesus. It's not passive resignation or spiritual bypassing. It's active trust in someone who has proven himself trustworthy. It's choosing to anchor yourself to truth that goes deeper than your current emotional weather. It's learning to live from a place of security that can't be threatened by insecurity. But I want to address something that might be coming up for some of you right now. Maybe you're thinking, this sounds great, Sarah, but what if I've tried to trust God before and things still went wrong? What if I've prayed and believed and hoped, and I still ended up getting hurt? That's a fair question, and it's one that deserves an honest answer. The promises of Jesus aren't guarantees that nothing bad will ever happen to you. They're not insurance policies against difficulty or pain or loss. What they are is guarantees about who God is and who you are to Him, regardless of what happens around you. They're promises about the ultimate outcome of your story, not about every chapter being easy. When Jesus promised that He had overcome the world, He said it right before going to the cross. When He promised to prepare a place for His followers, He said it right before being arrested and crucified. When He promised that His Father cares for them more than the birds of the air, He said it to people who would face persecution, rejection, and martyrdom. These promises weren't given to people whose lives were easy. They were given to people whose lives were hard, uncertain, and often dangerous. But they were people who discovered that there's something more ultimate than their circumstances, and that something is the love and faithfulness of God. This means that resting in these promises doesn't protect you from every storm, but it does give you an anchor that holds in every storm. It doesn't guarantee that you'll never feel anxious again, but it does guarantee that your anxiety doesn't have to have the final word in your life. It doesn't promise that all your problems will be solved, but it does promise that you're held by someone who is bigger than any problem you could face. And here's what I've discovered about people who learn to live this way. They don't become less human or less feeling. If anything, they become more fully human, because they're not spending all their energy trying to protect themselves from being human. They feel their feelings fully. They face their circumstances honestly, but they do it from a place of knowing that their ultimate security doesn't depend on their feelings or their circumstances. They become people who can sit with others in their anxiety without trying to fix it, because they know that being anxious doesn't mean being abandoned. They become people who can face uncertain futures without being paralyzed by fear, because they know that their security isn't based on knowing what's coming next. They become people who can experience genuine peace in the middle of genuine difficulty, because they've learned that peace isn't the absence of problems, it's the presence of Jesus in the problems. This is what's available to you right now, in this moment, regardless of what you're facing, not as a reward for having enough faith, or being good enough, or figuring out how to believe better, but as a gift that's already been given, a peace that's already been purchased, a security that's already been established. The question isn't whether Jesus' promises are true. The question is whether you're ready to live like they're true. Whether you're ready to move from trying to manage your anxiety to learning to rest in something bigger than your anxiety. Whether you're ready to discover what it feels like to be anchored to something that can't be shaken, even when everything else in your life feels like it's shifting. So let me take you even deeper into what this transformation actually looks like in the messiness of real life. Because one thing I've learned after walking with thousands of people through their anxiety is that there's often a gap between understanding these promises intellectually and experiencing them when your world feels like it's spinning out of control. It's like knowing that a bridge is strong enough to hold you versus actually walking across it when you're afraid of heights. I remember working with a woman named Jessica who came to me in the middle of what she called her season of falling apart. She had been a high-functioning anxiety sufferer for years. You know the type. From the outside, everything looked perfect. Successful career, beautiful family, active in her community. But inside, she was drowning in a constant undercurrent of worry that had gradually gotten worse over time. When I first met Jessica, she could quote scripture like nobody's business. She knew every verse about peace, every promise about God's faithfulness, every passage about not worrying. But she said something to me that broke my heart. "Sarah, I know all the right answers, but when I'm lying in bed at 3 a.m. with my heart pounding, those verses feel like they're written in a foreign language. I can read them, I can say them, but I can't seem to get them from my head to my heart where I actually need them." Does that resonate with anyone? Because this is where so many people get stuck. We have head knowledge of God's promises, but we haven't learned how to access heart transformation. We know what we should believe, but we don't know how to experience what we believe when our nervous system is in full alarm mode. Here's what I discovered working with Jessica, and what I've seen happen in my own life and in the lives of countless others. The promises of Jesus aren't meant to be applied like band-aids to our anxiety. They're meant to be absorbed like nutrients into our souls, and that absorption happens differently than we might expect. Most of us try to use God's promises like medication. When we feel anxious, we pull out a verse and hope it makes the anxiety go away. But what if these promises are more like vitamins? What if they're meant to be taken regularly, absorbed slowly, and allowed to strengthen us from the inside out over time? Think about how vitamins work. You don't take vitamin C when you feel a cold coming on and expect it to instantly cure you. You take vitamin C consistently so that when you're exposed to illness, your immune system is strong enough to fight it off. The promises of Jesus work similarly. When you regularly absorb them into your soul, they build up your spiritual immune system, so that when anxiety attacks, you have reserves of peace to draw from. But here's where it gets practical. How do you actually absorb these promises, rather than just intellectually acknowledge them? How do you move from knowing about God's peace to experiencing it in your body, your emotions, your middle-of-the-night panic sessions? The first thing I learned is that your body has to be involved in this process. You can't think your way into experiencing God's peace if your nervous system is stuck in fight-or-flight mode. Your brain and your body have to be on the same team for this to work, and that means learning to create what I call sacred space, physical and emotional space where you can actually receive what God is offering. Let me paint you a picture of what this looks like. When Jessica first started practicing this, she would set aside 10 minutes every morning, not to read her Bible or pray in the traditional sense, but to simply sit quietly and invite Jesus' presence into whatever she was feeling. If she woke up anxious, she wouldn't try to pray the anxiety away. Instead, she would sit with it and say something like, "Jesus, I'm feeling really worried about my presentation today. I know you've promised to be with me, and right now I'm going to rest in that promise, even though I still feel scared." Notice what she's doing here. She's not trying to eliminate the anxiety before she can access God's peace. She's inviting God's peace into the space where the anxiety lives. She's learning to hold both realities, her human feelings and God's supernatural peace, at the same time. The breakthrough came about 6 weeks into this practice. Jessica called me one afternoon, and I could hear something different in her voice. She said, "Sarah, the weirdest thing happened this morning. I woke up with that familiar knot in my stomach about a meeting I have this afternoon. But instead of spiraling into all the what-if scenarios like I usually do, I found myself automatically thinking, I don't know how this meeting is going to go, but I know I'm held by someone who cares about the outcome more than I do. And the crazy thing is, I actually believed it, not just in my head, but in my chest, in my body. I felt held. This is what it looks like when God's promises move from information to transformation. It's not that Jessica never felt anxious again. It's that she learned to experience anxiety from a place of being held, rather than from a place of being alone with her fears. She discovered that she could feel scared and safe at the same time, worried and secure simultaneously, uncertain about circumstances, but certain about God's character. But here's what's really important to understand about this process. It's not linear. Some days, Jessica felt that deep sense of being held, and other days she struggled to access it. Some mornings her 10 minutes of sacred space felt like a direct connection to heaven, and other mornings it felt like talking to the ceiling. This is normal. This is part of the process. Most of us give up too quickly because we expect spiritual growth to work like a math equation. If I do A plus B, I should always get C. But spiritual transformation is more like learning to garden. You plant seeds, you water them, you provide good conditions, but you can't control exactly when or how they grow. Some days there's visible progress, other days it looks like nothing is happening, but underground, roots are growing deeper. The key is consistency rather than intensity. It's better to spend 5 minutes every day creating sacred space for God's promises to take root than to have one dramatic 2-hour prayer session and then nothing for a month. Your soul needs regular, gentle exposure to truth, not occasional overwhelming doses. And here's something else I've learned that might surprise you. The promises of Jesus often work best when we stop trying so hard to make them work. There's something about desperation and striving that actually blocks our ability to receive. It's like trying to catch soap with wet hands. The harder you squeeze, the more likely it is to slip away. I think about another person I worked with, a man named David, who came to me in the middle of a career transition that had triggered severe anxiety. He had been laid off after 15 years with the same company, and at 52 years old, he was convinced that his career was over. The job market in his field was brutal, and every rejection letter felt like confirmation that he was too old, too expensive, too obsolete. David approached God's promises like a project manager approaches a deadline, with charts and goals and measurable outcomes. He would read scripture for exactly 30 minutes every morning, pray through specific verses about God's provision, and then get frustrated when he didn't feel immediately peaceful about his situation. He was trying so hard to access God's peace that he was actually creating more tension in the process. The shift happened when David stopped trying to manage his spiritual life and started simply showing up to it. Instead of trying to feel peaceful, he started being honest about feeling scared. Instead of trying to muster up faith, he started telling God about his doubts. Instead of trying to claim promises with confidence he didn't have, he started saying things like, "God, I want to believe that you see me and that you have good plans for me, but honestly, I'm terrified that I'm going to lose my house. Help me trust you even when I can't see how this is going to work out." That honesty became the doorway to experiencing God's peace in a way that all his striving never could. Because here's the thing about Jesus. He's not impressed by our spiritual performance. He's not waiting for us to get our faith together before he offers us his peace. He's drawn to our honesty, our vulnerability, our willingness to show up exactly as we are. When David stopped trying to be the perfect, anxious Christian and started being the honest, scared human, something beautiful happened. He began to experience God's presence not as something he had to earn or achieve, but as something that was already there, waiting for him to notice it. The promises stopped being things he had to work to believe and started being descriptions of a reality he was already living in. This is crucial for anyone who's struggling with anxiety, because anxiety often comes with a side of shame. We think we shouldn't be feeling this way, especially if we're people of faith. We think our anxiety somehow proves that we don't trust God enough or that we're failing spiritually. But what if your anxiety isn't evidence of weak faith? What if it's simply evidence that you're human, living in a broken world, dealing with real challenges that naturally produce worry? Jesus never shamed anyone for feeling anxious. When his disciples were terrified in the boat during the storm, he didn't lecture them about having more faith before he calmed the waves. When they were worried about what they would eat and wear, he didn't tell them they were being selfish before he promised that God would provide for them. He met them in their anxiety with compassion and truth. That's exactly how he wants to meet you. Not after you get your anxiety under control, but right in the middle of it. Not when you feel spiritual enough to deserve his peace, but when you're desperate enough to receive it. The promises of Jesus aren't rewards for having strong faith. They're lifelines for when your faith feels weak. But let me address something that might be stirring in your heart right now. Maybe you're thinking, Sarah, this all sounds wonderful, but what about those times when the promises feel empty? What about when you're praying and believing and trusting and the situation just keeps getting worse? What about when God feels silent and the anxiety feels louder than ever? I'm so glad you asked, because this is where the rubber really meets the road. This is where a lot of well-meaning spiritual advice falls apart, and it's exactly where the promises of Jesus prove they're not just feel-good platitudes, but solid rock you can build your life on. There was a season in my own life when I thought I had this whole resting in God's promises thing figured out. I'd been walking in unusual peace for several months, feeling like I had finally cracked the code on anxiety management. And then life happened. My mum was diagnosed with cancer, my husband lost his job, and our teenage daughter started struggling with depression, all within the span of 6 weeks. Suddenly, all the promises that had felt so real and accessible seemed like they were written in invisible ink. I would read, "Do not let your hearts be troubled," and my heart felt more troubled than it had in years. I would try to rest in the promise that God cares for me more than the birds, and I felt like I was in free fall with no safety net in sight. This is where I learned one of the most important lessons about resting in God's promises. They're not dependent on your ability to feel them. Just like the sun doesn't stop shining when clouds block your view of it, God's promises don't stop being true when circumstances make them hard to perceive. During that difficult season, I had to learn the difference between God's promises and my experience of God's promises. My experience was fluctuating wildly based on circumstances, emotions, and how much sleep I got the night before. But God's promises remained constant, like bedrock beneath shifting sand. This is where faith becomes less about feeling and more about choosing. Not blind choosing. You're not pretending that difficult circumstances aren't real or that your anxiety isn't valid, but informed choosing based on what you know to be true about God's character, even when your emotions are telling you something different. I started practicing what I call anchoring prayers during that season. When anxiety would hit and the promises felt distant, I would say things like, "God, I can't feel your peace right now, but I'm choosing to believe it's still there. I can't see how you're working in this situation, but I'm choosing to trust that you are. I don't understand why all of this is happening at once, but I'm choosing to rest in the promise that you have good plans for us, even when those plans are invisible to me." Notice that these prayers don't require me to feel peaceful or confident or spiritually strong. They just require me to make a choice about where I'm going to anchor my soul when everything feels unstable. And here's what I discovered. Making that choice repeatedly, especially when I didn't feel like it, actually began to shift something deep inside me. It's like working out when you don't feel like exercising. You don't wait until you feel motivated to go to the gym. You go to the gym, and the motivation often follows the action. Similarly, you don't wait until you feel peaceful to rest in God's promises. You rest in God's promises, and the peace often follows the choice. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you make the choice to trust. You anchor yourself to truth, and you still feel anxious. Sometimes you rest in God's promises, and your circumstances still feel overwhelming. This doesn't mean the promises aren't working. It means they're working at a level deeper than your emotions. Think about it this way. When you take medicine for an infection, you don't always feel better immediately. Sometimes you feel worse before you feel better as your body fights off the illness. But the medicine is still working, even when you can't feel it working. God's promises operate similarly. They're working to heal and restore and strengthen you at levels you can't always perceive in the moment. This is why consistency matters more than intensity when it comes to resting in God's promises. It's not about having one powerful spiritual experience that fixes everything. It's about the daily choice to anchor yourself to truth, especially on the days when that truth feels more like a decision than a feeling. And here's something beautiful that happens when you practice this long enough. You start to notice that your capacity for peace is expanding. Situations that would have sent you into complete panic a year ago now feel manageable. Circumstances that would have kept you awake for weeks now might still cause concern, but they don't steal your fundamental sense of security. You're not becoming less human or less feeling. You're becoming more rooted. Like a tree that's been growing for years, storms still affect it, seasons still change its appearance, but its root system is so deep and strong that it takes a lot more to uproot it. This is what maturity in faith looks like. It's not about never feeling anxious. It's about having anxiety without being controlled by it. It's about feeling uncertain about circumstances while remaining certain about God's character. It's about learning to distinguish between what's temporary and what's eternal, what's within your control, and what's God's responsibility. But I want to be really practical here because I know some of you are thinking, okay, Sarah, this makes sense in theory, but I need to know exactly what to do when I wake up at 2 a.m. and my mind is racing. Fair enough. Let me give you a step-by-step process that you can use tonight, tomorrow, or whenever anxiety tries to hijack your peace. First, when you notice anxiety rising, don't fight it. Fighting anxiety is like trying to swim upstream. It takes enormous energy and usually makes things worse. Instead, acknowledge what's happening. Say something like, I notice that I'm feeling really anxious right now. My chest is tight, my thoughts are spinning, and I'm scared about whatever the specific concern is. Be specific. Vague anxiety is harder to address than specific anxiety. Second, remember that you don't have to fix the anxiety before you can access God's peace. This is huge. Most of us think we need to calm down before we can pray or rest in God's promises. But Jesus offers his peace to anxious people, not to people who have already figured out how to be peaceful. So bring your anxiety with you into his presence instead of trying to leave it at the door. Third, choose one of the promises we've talked about and speak it over your situation, not as a magic formula, but as a declaration of what's true even when it doesn't feel true. For example, Jesus, you promised that you've gone to prepare a place for me. I don't know how this situation is going to work out, but I'm choosing to rest in the promise that you're already working in my future in ways I can't see. Fourth, do something physical to help your body shift out of fight or flight mode. This might sound unspiritual, but remember, you're not just a soul, you're a soul in a body, and God designed your body to be part of your spiritual experience. Take slow, deep breaths. Put your hand on your heart and feel it beating. Go outside and look at the stars. The goal isn't to eliminate anxiety, but to create space where peace can coexist with concern. Finally, do something to redirect your focus from what you can't control to what you can control. Maybe that's praying for someone else who's struggling. Maybe it's writing down 3 things you're grateful for. Maybe it's doing one small task that gives you a sense of accomplishment. The point is to remind yourself that you're not completely powerless, even in situations where you can't control the outcome. Now, I want to be clear about something. This isn't a formula that will instantly eliminate anxiety from your life. If you're dealing with clinical anxiety or panic disorder, please don't hear me saying that spiritual practices are a substitute for professional help. God uses doctors and therapists and medication as part of his healing work in our lives. Faith and psychology aren't enemies, they're allies in the battle for your mental and emotional health. What I am saying is that regardless of what other resources you're using to address anxiety, learning to rest in the promises of Jesus adds a dimension to your healing that nothing else can provide. It addresses the spiritual roots of anxiety in ways that purely psychological approaches can't touch. It offers hope that goes deeper than symptom management. It provides an identity and security that can't be shaken by circumstances. And here's what I've seen happen in my own life and in the lives of so many others. When you learn to live from this place of deep spiritual security, it actually enhances the effectiveness of other anxiety treatments. When you know who you are and whose you are at the core level, therapy becomes more effective because you're not trying to find your identity in the process. Medication can be more helpful because you're not using it as your only source of hope. Self-care practices become more sustainable because you're not relying on them to provide what only God can provide. This is the beauty of approaching anxiety holistically, addressing the physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual dimensions of your experience. Because you are a whole person, and healing that lasts usually involves your whole person. But let me take you back to where we started, because I think it's important to remember why this matters so much. You didn't stumble across this video by accident. Something in your heart knew you needed to hear about the promises of Jesus for anxiety. Maybe you've tried everything else, maybe you're at the end of your rope, maybe you're just tired of living with a low-level hum of worry that never quite goes away. Whatever brought you here, I want you to know that your anxiety doesn't disqualify you from experiencing the peace of Jesus. Your worry doesn't make you a second-class citizen in the kingdom of God. Your sleepless nights don't mean you have weak faith. They mean you're human, living in a broken world, and you need something bigger than yourself to anchor your soul to. That something bigger is available to you right now, not as a reward for getting your life together, not as a prize for having enough faith, but as a gift that's already been given. Jesus purchased your peace with his life. He secured your future with his sacrifice. He guaranteed your safety with his resurrection. These aren't things you have to earn. They're things you get to receive. And receiving is different from achieving. Achieving requires effort, performance, meeting certain standards. Receiving just requires opening your hands and letting someone else do the work. That's exactly what Jesus invites you to do with your anxiety. Stop trying so hard to fix it, manage it, overcome it on your own. Open your hands and receive the peace he's already purchased for you. This doesn't mean you become passive about addressing anxiety in practical ways. It means you stop carrying the weight of responsibility for outcomes that are ultimately out of your control. It means you do what you can and trust God with what you can't. It means you take action from a place of rest rather than from a place of striving. Imagine what your life could look like if you lived from this place. Not a life without challenges, but a life where challenges don't define your internal weather. Not a life without uncertainty, but a life where uncertainty doesn't steal your peace. Not a life without problems, but a life where problems don't have the final word in your story. This is what Jesus offers you. Not just management of your anxiety, but transformation of your entire relationship with uncertainty, fear, and the unknown. Not just coping strategies, but a completely different way of being human in a chaotic world. Not just temporary relief, but permanent access to a peace that really does surpass understanding. I know some of you might be wondering if this sounds too good to be true. Maybe you've been disappointed before by promises that didn't seem to work out the way you expected. Maybe you've prayed and hoped and trusted, only to feel like God was silent when you needed him most. I understand that hesitation, and I want to honor it because it comes from real pain and real experience. But here's what I've learned about God's promises. They're not dependent on our ability to understand them or even feel them working. They're like gravity. Gravity doesn't stop working when you can't see it or when you're not thinking about it. It's a constant force that holds everything together, whether you're aware of it or not. Jesus' promises work the same way. They're not contingent on your emotional state, your circumstances, or even your faith level on any given day. They're based on his character, his love for you, and what he accomplished on the cross. And that foundation is more solid than your feelings, more reliable than your circumstances, and more permanent than any anxiety you're experiencing. Let me tell you about Maria, a single mom I worked with who was drowning in financial anxiety. She had been laid off from her job 3 months earlier, and despite applying everywhere, she couldn't find work. Her savings were almost gone. She was behind on rent, and she had 2 kids depending on her. Every night, she would lie in bed calculating and recalculating her expenses, trying to figure out how to make $27 stretch until her next unemployment check. Maria knew all about God's promises to provide. She had grown up in church. She could quote Philippians 4:19 by heart, "And my God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus." But when she was staring at that nearly empty bank account, those words felt like they were written for someone else, someone whose needs were smaller or whose faith was stronger. The breakthrough came when Maria stopped trying to feel provided for and started acting like she was provided for. Now let me be clear. This wasn't some prosperity gospel nonsense where she went out and spent money she didn't have because she was claiming God's provision. This was something much more subtle and much more powerful. Maria started making decisions from a place of trust rather than from a place of panic. Instead of applying for jobs frantically and desperately, she started approaching her job search with a sense of purpose and dignity, knowing that God saw her situation and was already working on her behalf. Instead of lying awake catastrophizing about worst-case scenarios, she started using those sleepless hours to pray for other people who were struggling. Instead of snapping at her kids because her stress was so high, she started being honest with them about their situation, while also reassuring them that they were going to be okay. She would say things like, "Money is really tight right now, and we might have to make some changes, but we're going to get through this because God is taking care of us." Here's what's remarkable. Maria's circumstances didn't change immediately. She didn't get a job the next week or win the lottery or have some wealthy relative appear out of nowhere, but something in her changed, and that something began to shift how she experienced her circumstances. She started sleeping better, not because her problems were solved, but because she had given the weight of solving them to someone bigger than herself. She started parenting with more patience, not because her stress was gone, but because she wasn't carrying the full burden of her family's security alone. She started interviewing better, not because she was less desperate for work, but because she was operating from a place of knowing her worth rather than from a place of fear. And you know what happened? 3 weeks after Maria made this internal shift, she got a job offer. Not just any job offer, a position that paid more than her previous job and came with better benefits. When she called to tell me about it, she said something I'll never forget. "Sarah, I don't think God gave me this job because I finally learned to trust him. I think he was always planning to give me this job, but he had to teach me how to receive it from a place of security rather than desperation." Dean, that's the difference between trying to use God's promises to control outcomes and learning to rest in them regardless of outcomes. When you're trying to use them as a formula, if I trust enough, then God will fix my situation, you're still carrying the weight of making things work. But when you learn to rest in them as statements of God's character and your identity, you're free to live from a place of security that doesn't depend on everything working out exactly the way you think it should. This is where anxiety starts losing its power over you, because anxiety feeds on the belief that your safety depends entirely on your ability to control, predict, and manage your circumstances. But when you start living from the deep knowledge that your ultimate safety rests in God's hands, anxiety becomes just one voice among many, instead of the loudest voice in the room. Now, I want to get really practical about what this looks like in those specific moments when anxiety is trying to take over. Because it's one thing to understand these concepts intellectually, and it's another thing entirely to know what to do when you're having a panic attack at your kitchen table, or when you wake up at 4 a.m. with your mind already racing through everything that could go wrong today. First, let me tell you what doesn't work in those moments. It doesn't work to try to logic your way out of anxiety. Your rational brain goes offline when your nervous system perceives threat, so trying to think your way to peace usually just creates more frustration. It doesn't work to shame yourself for feeling anxious. I shouldn't be feeling this way. I'm supposed to trust God. What's wrong with me? That just adds guilt to anxiety, which makes everything worse. It definitely doesn't work to try to pray away the anxiety like it's a demon that needs to be cast out. Anxiety isn't evil. It's a normal human response to perceived danger. Sometimes it's accurate, sometimes it's not, but it's always trying to protect you in some way. What does work is learning to create what I call holy space in the middle of your anxiety. This is space where you can be fully human, scared, worried, uncertain, while simultaneously being fully held by God. It's space where you don't have to choose between honesty about your feelings and faith in God's character. Here's a specific example of what this looks like. Let's say you wake up in the middle of the night with your heart pounding because you just remembered that big presentation you have to give tomorrow, and suddenly your mind is flooded with all the ways it could go wrong. Instead of lying there trying to convince yourself everything will be fine, you might say something like this: God, I'm really scared about tomorrow. My heart is racing, and I can't stop thinking about all the things that could go wrong. I know you've promised to be with me, and right now I'm choosing to rest in that promise, even though I still feel afraid. I don't know how the presentation will go, and I know you care about it more than I do. Help me remember that my worth doesn't depend on performing perfectly tomorrow. Notice what's happening there. You're not denying the anxiety or trying to make it go away before you can access God's presence. You're bringing the anxiety with you into God's presence and letting His promises speak into the space where fear lives. But here's what's crucial. This isn't a one-and-done solution. You might have to do this several times throughout the night. You might have to do it again in the morning. You might have to do it right before you walk into that meeting room. This isn't about finding the perfect prayer that eliminates anxiety forever. It's about learning to return to truth every time fear tries to convince you that you're on your own. Think of it like learning to play a musical instrument. At first, you have to consciously think about every note, every finger placement, every breath. It's clunky and requires enormous concentration. But as you practice, it becomes more natural, more fluid, more automatic. Eventually, you can play beautiful music without having to think about the mechanics. Learning to rest in God's promises works the same way. At first, it feels awkward and forced. You have to consciously remind yourself of truth when your emotions are screaming something different. You have to deliberately choose to anchor yourself to God's character when your circumstances feel overwhelming. But as you practice, it becomes more natural. Eventually, your default response to anxiety becomes reaching for God's peace rather than reaching for control. I think about David from the Psalms, who gave us such an honest picture of what this looks like in real life. One minute he's declaring, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing," and the next minute he's crying out, "How long, Lord? Will you forget me forever?" He's not being inconsistent. He's being human. He's showing us that faith isn't about maintaining constant emotional equilibrium. It's about repeatedly returning to truth when fear tries to pull you away from it. That's exactly what you're learning to do. You're not trying to become someone who never feels anxious. You're learning to become someone who feels anxiety without being controlled by it. Someone who can acknowledge fear while remaining anchored to hope. Someone who can face uncertainty while staying grounded in what's certain about God's love and faithfulness. And here's something beautiful that happens as you practice this. You start to notice that your anxiety is actually becoming a doorway to deeper intimacy with God. Those moments when you feel most vulnerable, most uncertain, most out of control, they become opportunities to experience God's presence in ways you never could when life felt manageable. It's like the difference between knowing about someone and knowing someone personally. You can read about God's faithfulness in books. You can hear about it in sermons. You can study it academically. But when you experience His steadiness in the middle of your shakiness, when you feel His peace in the midst of your panic, when you discover His strength in your weakness, that's when head knowledge becomes heart knowledge. This is why I've come to believe that our struggles with anxiety aren't obstacles to spiritual growth. They're invitations to it. They're opportunities to discover aspects of God's character that we might never encounter in easier seasons. They're chances to experience His comfort in ways that only come when we actually need comforting. But this requires a fundamental shift in how we think about anxiety. Instead of seeing it as evidence that something is wrong with us spiritually, we can start seeing it as evidence that we're human beings living in a world that often feels unsafe and uncertain. Instead of viewing it as something to be ashamed of, we can start understanding it as something that connects us to the heart of a God who knows what it feels like to be vulnerable. Jesus experienced anxiety. In the Garden of Gethsemane, He was so distressed about what He was about to face that He sweated drops of blood. He asked His Father if there was any other way to accomplish what needed to be done. He wanted His closest friends to stay awake and pray with Him, because He didn't want to face the most difficult hours of His life alone. This wasn't weakness. This was humanity. And it means that when you're feeling anxious, you're not disqualifying yourself from God's love or proving that your faith is insufficient. You're joining a long tradition of people who have brought their fears and uncertainties to a God who understands what it feels like to be human. The difference is that you don't have to stay stuck in the anxiety. You can feel it, acknowledge it, bring it to God, and then choose to rest in something bigger than what you're afraid of. You can experience the full range of human emotion while remaining anchored to divine truth. You can be fully present to your struggles while being fully confident in God's ultimate victory over everything that threatens your peace. This is what it means to live in the tension between already and not yet. Already forgiven, not yet perfected. Already secure in God's love, not yet free from all fear. Already promised ultimate victory, not yet experiencing complete resolution of every problem. This tension isn't something to be solved. It's something to be lived in with grace. And as you learn to live in this tension with grace, something remarkable happens. You start becoming a safe person for other anxious people to be around. Because you're not trying to fix their anxiety or shame them out of it or offer simplistic solutions to complex problems. You're able to sit with them in their uncertainty because you've learned to sit with your own. You become someone who can offer real hope instead of false hope. False hope says everything is going to work out exactly the way you want it to. Real hope says that no matter how things work out, you're held by someone who loves you and has good plans for your future. False hope is dependent on circumstances. Real hope is dependent on God's character. You start living as someone who has found something more reliable than your ability to control outcomes, something more trustworthy than your capacity to predict the future, something more secure than your skill at managing all the variables. In your life, you found your security in the unshakable love of God, and that security can't be threatened by circumstances that shift and change. This doesn't mean you become careless or reckless, it means you become free. Free to take reasonable precautions without being consumed by worst-case scenarios. Free to plan wisely without being paralyzed by what-if thinking. Free to care deeply about outcomes without being crushed when outcomes don't match your expectations. You learn to hold things lightly, your plans, your preferences, your vision of how life should unfold. Not because these things don't matter, but because you've found something that matters more. You found an identity that can't be shaken by circumstances, a security that can't be threatened by uncertainty, and a peace that doesn't depend on everything in your life being peaceful. This is the invitation that Jesus extends to every anxious heart. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Not rest from all responsibility, not rest from all challenge, but rest for your soul. Rest that comes from knowing you're not carrying the weight of your world alone. Rest that comes from trusting someone bigger than yourself with the outcomes you can't control. That rest is available to you right now, in this moment, regardless of what's causing your anxiety. It's not something you have to earn through perfect faith or achieve through flawless spiritual performance. It's something that's already been given, already been purchased, already been made available to anyone who's willing to receive it. The question isn't whether you deserve it. None of us deserve it. The question isn't whether you're spiritual enough to access it. It's accessed through need, not through spiritual achievement. The question is simply this: are you ready to stop trying to manage your anxiety on your own and start learning to rest in promises that are bigger than your biggest fears? Because those promises are waiting for you. They're waiting to become the foundation you build your life on, instead of just nice thoughts you think about occasionally. They're waiting to become the atmosphere you breathe, instead of just verses you quote when things get really bad. They're waiting to transform not just how you think about anxiety, but how you experience life itself. And that transformation doesn't happen all at once. It happens one anxious moment at a time, one choice to trust at a time, one decision to rest instead of strive at a time. It happens as you practice returning to truth when fear tries to convince you that you're alone. It happens as you learn to hold both your humanity and God's promises simultaneously. It happens as you discover that peace isn't the absence of problems. It's the presence of Jesus in the problems, and that presence is available to you not just in the big, dramatic moments of crisis, but in the small, daily moments of ordinary anxiety. In the traffic jams and difficult conversations and uncertain outcomes that make up most of life. This is where the promises of Jesus prove they're not just emergency interventions for crisis moments, but a completely different way of being human in an uncertain world. They're an invitation to live from a place of rest instead of a place of striving, from a place of trust instead of a place of control, from a place of security that can't be shaken instead of a place of fear about what might be taken away. That invitation is extended to you right now, exactly as you are, with whatever anxiety you're carrying, whatever circumstances you're facing, whatever fears are keeping you awake at night. You don't have to get your life together first. You don't have to figure out how to have more faith. You don't have to solve your anxiety problem before you can access God's peace. You just have to be willing to receive what's already being offered. And that receiving starts with one simple but revolutionary choice, the choice to rest. So what does it actually mean to make that choice to rest, when everything in your culture, everything in your upbringing, maybe everything in your personality is screaming at you to do something, fix something, control something? Because let's be honest, most of us have been conditioned to believe that resting is what you do after you've solved all your problems, not what you do in the middle of them. I remember talking to a woman named Jennifer who said something that perfectly captured this struggle. She told me, "Sarah, when you tell me to rest in God's promises, it feels like you're telling me to just sit in a burning building and trust that everything's going to be okay. Every fiber of my being is telling me I need to get up and do something about this situation." And that's such an honest response, and it reveals something important about how we've been taught to think about rest. We've been taught that rest is passive, that it's giving up, that it's the absence of action. But the kind of rest that Jesus offers is completely different. It's not passive. It's the most active thing you can do. It's not giving up. It's giving over. It's not the absence of action. It's action from a completely different source of strength. Think about a skilled surgeon performing a complex operation. From the outside, her hands look completely steady, almost effortless. But that steadiness isn't coming from trying really hard to keep her hands still. It's coming from years of training, from deep knowledge, from confidence in her abilities, from trust in her team. She's intensely focused and actively engaged, but she's operating from a place of rest. Rest in her preparation, rest in her expertise, rest in the systems around her. That's what it looks like to rest in God's promises while actively engaging with your circumstances. You're not passive or careless or irresponsible. You're operating from a different foundation. Instead of operating from anxiety about outcomes, you're operating from confidence in God's character. Instead of operating from fear about what might happen, you're operating from security in what you know to be true about God's love for you. But here's where this gets really practical, because I know some of you are thinking, okay, that sounds nice in theory, but what does that actually look like when I'm facing a real crisis? Let me tell you about Marcus, a father of 3 who came to see me when his company was going through massive layoffs. He had been with the company for 12 years. He was 3 years away from having his house paid off, and his oldest daughter was a senior in high school looking at colleges. Every day for 2 months, Marcus would go to work not knowing if this would be the day he got called into HR and told his position was being eliminated. The anxiety was consuming him. He couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate, couldn't be present with his family because his mind was constantly spinning through financial calculations and worst-case scenarios. Marcus is a man of faith, but when I first met him, he said something that broke my heart. "Sarah, I keep trying to trust God with this situation, but every time I think I've given it to him, I take it back. I'll pray and feel peaceful for about 5 minutes, and then my mind starts racing again about how we're going to pay for college or what we'll do if we lose the house. I feel like I'm failing at faith." This is where so many people get stuck. They think that resting in God's promises means having one prayer conversation where you hand everything over to God and then never worry about it again. But that's not how it works for most of us, and it's not how it worked for most of the people in Scripture either. Look at David in the Psalms. He's constantly having to remind himself of God's faithfulness. He's constantly talking himself through his fears and back to trust. "Why, my soul, are you downcast? Put your hope in God, for I will yet praise him, my Savior and my God." He's not saying this once and being done with it. He's saying it over and over again, as many times as he needs to say it. That's exactly what Marcus learned to do. Instead of trying to achieve some perfect state of trust that would eliminate all anxiety, he learned to make the choice to rest every single time anxiety tried to take over. When his mind would start racing about financial scenarios, he would say, "God, I'm feeling really scared about our future right now. I don't know what's going to happen with my job, and I know you see our situation and you have good plans for our family. I'm choosing to rest in that truth, even though I still feel worried." Notice he's not pretending he doesn't feel worried. He's not trying to muster up a confidence he doesn't have. He's simply choosing to anchor himself to what he knows to be true about God's character in the midst of uncertainty about his circumstances. And then he would take practical action from that place of rest. He updated his resume. He networked with colleagues. He had honest conversations with his family about their situation. But he did all of these things from a place of knowing that his family's ultimate security didn't depend on his ability to control outcomes. It depended on God's faithfulness to his promises. The beautiful thing is, Marcus did end up keeping his job. But even more beautiful is what he told me months later. "Sarah, I'm grateful I kept my job, but I'm even more grateful for what I learned during that season. I discovered that I could face my worst fears without being destroyed by them. I learned that my peace doesn't have to be held hostage by circumstances I can't control. That's worth more than job security." This is what happens when you learn to rest in God's promises. You don't become someone who never faces difficult circumstances. You become someone who faces difficult circumstances from a completely different foundation. You become someone who can walk through valleys without being consumed by them because you know who's walking with you. But let me address something that might be stirring in some of your hearts right now. Maybe you're thinking, Sarah, what about those times when the worst-case scenario actually happens? What about when you're trusting God and resting in His promises, and then you do lose the job, you do get the devastating diagnosis, the relationship does end, the financial crisis does hit? What about when it feels like God didn't come through the way you expected Him to? This is such an important question, and it's one that deserves a deeply honest answer. Because if I'm going to tell you that God's promises are trustworthy, then I need to be able to address what happens when life doesn't unfold the way we hoped it would, even when we were trusting and praying and believing. Here's what I've learned, both from my own experience and from walking with hundreds of people through their darkest seasons. God's promises aren't guarantees about how your story will unfold. They're guarantees about how your story will end. They're not promises that nothing bad will ever happen to you. They're promises about who God will be in whatever happens to you. When Jesus promised that He had overcome the world, He wasn't promising that His followers would never experience the brokenness of this world. He was promising that the brokenness wouldn't have the final word. When He promised to never leave or forsake us, He wasn't promising that we would never walk through dark valleys. He was promising to walk through them with us. I think about my friend Rachel, whose husband died suddenly of a heart attack when he was only 43, leaving her with 2 young children and a mortgage she couldn't afford on her teacher's salary. Rachel had been trusting God, resting in His promises about provision and protection. She had been praying for her husband's health, believing that God would heal the heart condition they didn't even know he had. When Rachel called to tell me what had happened, she said something that has stayed with me for years. Sarah, I feel like my world has completely fallen apart, and somehow I still know that I'm held. I don't understand why this happened, and I know that God hasn't abandoned us. I'm heartbroken, and I'm not hopeless. That's what it looks like when your foundation is deeper than your circumstances. Rachel's circumstances had changed dramatically and devastatingly. But her identity as someone who was loved, held, and secure in God's ultimate plan for her life, that hadn't changed. Her future looked completely different than what she had expected, but her confidence that God would walk with her into that future remained solid. This is where the promises of Jesus prove they're not just nice thoughts for easy times, but bedrock truth for the hardest seasons of life. They don't promise that every story will have a happy ending from our perspective. They promise that every story will have a redemptive ending from God's perspective. They don't guarantee that we'll never experience loss, grief, or heartbreak. They guarantee that loss, grief, and heartbreak won't be the end of our stories. But here's what's remarkable about God's promises. They often prove themselves most powerfully in the very circumstances we thought would destroy our faith. It's in the hospital rooms and the funeral parlors and the bankruptcy courts that people discover Jesus' presence in ways they never experienced in easier seasons. It's in the places where human resources run out that divine resources show up most clearly. Rachel discovered this in ways that honestly amazed me. In the months following her husband's death, I watched her experience God's provision in the most unexpected ways, not magical provision. She still had to make difficult financial decisions and adjust to single parenting, but provision that showed up exactly when and how she needed it. Job opportunities that seemed impossible given her circumstances. Community support that surrounded her family with love and practical help. Strength to get through days that should have been unbearable. More than that, Rachel became a source of hope for other people walking through loss. Because she had learned to hold grief and trust simultaneously, she could sit with other widows and say, "This is the worst thing that's ever happened to me, and God is still faithful." She could acknowledge the reality of devastating loss while pointing to the reality of unshakable hope. This is what it means that God works all things together for good for those who love him. It doesn't mean that all things are good. Rachel's husband's death wasn't good. It means that God can weave even the worst circumstances into a story of redemption and purpose that we could never have imagined. But experiencing this kind of redemptive perspective requires a different relationship with control than most of us are comfortable with. It requires accepting that we can't control outcomes, but we can control where we anchor our souls when outcomes don't match our expectations. It requires learning to find our security in God's character rather than in life going according to our plans. This is probably the hardest part of learning to rest in God's promises, because everything in our culture tells us that security comes from being able to predict and control our circumstances. We're told that responsible adults have backup plans for their backup plans, that smart people prepare for every contingency, that mature faith means never being caught off guard by difficulty. But what if mature faith actually looks like the opposite? What if it looks like holding your plans lightly while holding God's character tightly? What if it looks like preparing wisely for the future while resting securely in God's sovereignty over that future? What if it looks like acknowledging that you can't control outcomes while trusting completely in the one who can? This is where anxiety starts losing its grip on your life, because anxiety is fundamentally about control. It's your brain's attempt to manage uncertainty by thinking through every possible scenario and preparing for every potential threat. But when you learn to find your security in something bigger than your ability to control circumstances, anxiety doesn't have the same power over you anymore. You can still feel it. You can still notice when your mind starts spinning through worst-case scenarios. But instead of being controlled by those thoughts, you can observe them with compassion and then choose to anchor yourself to something more reliable than your ability to predict the future. I think about Jesus sleeping in the boat during the storm. The disciples are panicking, convinced they're about to die, and Jesus is so at rest that he's sound asleep. When they wake him up, he doesn't panic with them. He speaks peace into the situation and the storm stops. But here's what strikes me most about this story. Jesus' peace wasn't dependent on the storm stopping. He was peaceful before he did anything about the storm. That's the kind of peace he offers you. Not peace that comes from having all your problems solved, but peace that can exist in the middle of unsolved problems. Not peace that comes from controlling your circumstances, but peace that comes from trusting the one who controls your circumstances. And this peace is available to you right now, in this moment, regardless of what storm you're facing. It's not something you have to earn or achieve or work up to. It's something that's already been given to you. The question is simply whether you're ready to receive it. Receiving it doesn't mean your circumstances will immediately change. It doesn't mean your anxiety will instantly disappear. It doesn't mean you'll suddenly have all the answers to your problems. What it means is that you'll have access to a foundation that can't be shaken by circumstances that shift and change. You'll have access to an identity that doesn't depend on your performance, your achievements, or your ability to keep everything under control. You'll have access to a future that's secure, not because you can see how everything is going to work out, but because you know who holds your future. You'll have access to peace that really doesn't make sense, given your circumstances. Peace that can coexist with uncertainty, calm that can exist alongside concern, rest that can happen even when your life feels anything but restful. This is the invitation that's being extended to you right now, not an invitation to a life without problems, but an invitation to a completely different way of experiencing problems. Not an invitation to never feel anxious again, but an invitation to experience anxiety from a place of being held rather than from a place of being alone. The promises of Jesus aren't just concepts to understand or verses to memorize. They're realities to live in, foundations to build on, atmospheres to breathe. They're meant to change not just how you think about your anxiety, but how you experience life itself. And that change happens one choice at a time. One moment of choosing to rest instead of strive. One decision to trust instead of control. One choice to anchor yourself to God's character instead of to your circumstances. Over time, those individual choices create a completely different way of being human in an uncertain world. So as we begin to wrap up our time together, I want to leave you with something practical you can take with you into whatever situation is causing you anxiety right now. Whether it's something specific that brought you to this video, or whether it's just that general sense of unease that seems to follow you through your days, there's something you can do right now to begin accessing the peace that Jesus has already made available to you. First, take a moment to acknowledge what you're actually feeling. Don't try to spiritualize it or minimize it or talk yourself out of it. Just notice what's happening in your body, in your emotions, in your thoughts. Maybe your chest feels tight. Maybe your mind is racing. Maybe you feel that familiar knot in your stomach. Just acknowledge it without judgment. Then instead of trying to fix those feelings or make them go away, invite Jesus into the space where those feelings live. You might say something like, "Jesus, I'm feeling really anxious about whatever the specific concern is. My mind is spinning, and I feel scared about what might happen. I know you've promised to be with me, and right now I'm choosing to rest in that promise even though I still feel afraid." I notice that you're not trying to eliminate the anxiety before you can access God's presence. You're bringing the anxiety with you into God's presence and letting His promises speak into the space where fear lives. You're learning to hold both your humanity and God's truth at the same time. Then do something physical to help your nervous system shift from fight or flight mode into a more receptive state. Take some slow, deep breaths. Put your hand on your heart and feel it beating steadily. Look out the window at the sky or the trees or whatever natural beauty is available to you. Remember that you're not just a soul having anxious thoughts. You're a soul in a body, and God designed your body to be part of your spiritual experience. Finally, choose one specific promise from Jesus to anchor yourself to, and speak it over your situation. Not as a magic formula that will instantly solve your problems, but as a declaration of what's true, even when it doesn't feel true. You might choose, "Jesus, you've promised that you've gone to prepare a place for me. I don't know how this situation is going to work out, but I'm resting in the promise that you're already working in my future in ways I can't see." Or maybe, "Jesus, you've promised that your Father cares for me more than He cares for the birds of the air. I'm worried about provision right now, but I'm choosing to rest in the promise that I'm seen and valued, and that my needs matter to the Creator of the universe." Or perhaps, "Jesus, you've promised that you've overcome the world. This situation feels overwhelming right now, but I'm anchoring myself to the truth that nothing I'm facing has the final say over my story." The key is to choose one promise and let it become the foundation you stand on in this moment. Don't try to claim all of them at once or work yourself up into some perfect state of faith. Just choose one truth about God's character and let it hold you steady while your circumstances feel unsteady. And then be patient with the process. This isn't about achieving instant transformation. It's about taking one small step toward learning to live from a different foundation. Some days this practice will feel powerful and life-changing. Other days it will feel like going through the motions. Both are normal. Both are part of the process of learning to rest in something bigger than yourself. Remember, you're not trying to manage your anxiety perfectly. You're learning to hold it differently. You're not trying to never feel scared again. You're learning to feel scared while also feeling held. You're not trying to control outcomes. You're learning to trust the one who controls outcomes. This is the journey from anxiety to rest, from striving to trusting, from fear to faith. It's not a journey you take alone. Jesus walks every step with you, and his promises are like signposts along the way, reminding you of where you're headed and who you belong to. The peace you're longing for isn't something you have to create or achieve or earn. It's something that's already been given to you. It's waiting for you to notice it, receive it, and learn to live from it. And that learning happens one anxious moment at a time, one choice to rest at a time, one decision to trust at a time. Your anxiety doesn't disqualify you from this peace. Your worry doesn't make you unworthy of this rest. Your sleepless nights don't mean you have weak faith. They mean you're human, and Jesus offers his promises specifically to humans who are struggling, not to people who have already figured out how to be peaceful. So wherever you are in your journey with anxiety, whatever has brought you to this moment, whatever you're facing that feels too big to handle, remember this: you are seen, you are loved, you are held by someone who has overcome everything that threatens your peace. Those aren't just nice words, they're the deepest realities of your existence, and those realities are strong enough to hold you through whatever storm you're facing. They're reliable enough to anchor your soul when everything else feels unstable. They're permanent enough to build your life on, regardless of how temporary your circumstances feel. The rest you've been searching for is available to you. The peace you've been longing for has already been purchased for you. The security you've been trying to create for yourself has already been established for you. All that's left is to receive it. And that receiving starts with one simple but revolutionary choice, the choice to rest. So let me take you deeper into what it actually means to make that choice to rest when your body is screaming danger and your mind is convinced that disaster is imminent. Because I know some of you are sitting there thinking, Sarah, this all sounds beautiful, but you don't understand my situation. You don't know what I'm dealing with. The anxiety I'm experiencing isn't just garden variety worry. It's consuming my life. I hear you. I really do. And I want you to know that the promises we've been exploring weren't given to people dealing with minor inconveniences. They were spoken into the most anxiety-provoking situations imaginable. Jesus spoke these words to people who were facing genuine threats, real dangers, and circumstances that would terrify anyone with a pulse. Think about it. When Jesus promised peace to his disciples, he was literally hours away from being crucified. When he told them not to let their hearts be troubled, he was speaking to men who were about to watch their leader, the person they had given up everything to follow, be brutally executed. When he promised that God cares for them more than the birds of the air, he was talking to people who would face persecution, imprisonment, and martyrdom for their faith. These promises weren't given in comfortable circumstances to people dealing with first-world problems. They were forged in the furnace of genuine human suffering and sealed with the blood of someone who understood what it meant to face your worst fears and walk through them anyway. This is why these promises have power in your situation, whatever that situation might be. They're not theoretical concepts developed by people who lived easy lives. They're battle-tested truths that have sustained human beings through the worst that life can throw at them. They've been proven reliable in concentration camps and cancer wards, in divorce courts and unemployment lines, in the places where human resources run out and divine resources are all that's left. But here's what I want you to understand about how these promises work in those extreme moments of anxiety. They don't work by eliminating the threat, or fixing the problem, or making the scary thing go away. They work by giving you access to a source of strength that's bigger than whatever you're facing. They work by reminding you of your true identity when circumstances try to convince you that you're powerless and alone. Let me tell you about Sarah, yes, another Sarah, who came to see me when her teenage son was struggling with severe depression and had been hospitalized after a suicide attempt. She was living in that horrible space that every parent fears, where you're watching your child suffer, and there's nothing you can do to fix it. Every day was a battle between hope and despair, between fighting for his recovery and preparing for the possibility that you might lose him. Sarah told me that she would wake up every morning with her heart already racing, immediately flooded with thoughts about whether today would be the day she got another phone call from the hospital. She couldn't eat, couldn't concentrate at work, couldn't be present for her other children because her mind was completely consumed with worst-case scenarios about her son's future. "The thing is," she said to me, "I know all the right things to say about trusting God. I know He loves my son even more than I do. I know He has good plans for our family. But when I'm lying in bed at 3 in the morning, imagining planning my child's funeral, those truths feel like they're written in a language I can't understand anymore." This is where so many people get stuck when they're dealing with severe anxiety. We think that accessing God's peace requires us to first get our emotions under control, to first work up enough faith to really believe the promises, to first reach some level of spiritual maturity where we can rise above our circumstances. But that's not how it works. God's promises aren't performance-based. They're not rewards for having strong faith or punishments for having weak faith. They're lifelines thrown to people who are drowning, and the only requirement for grabbing onto them is being desperate enough to reach for them. Sarah learned this in the most profound way. Instead of trying to believe her way out of her anxiety, she started bringing her anxiety with her into God's presence. Instead of trying to muster up faith she didn't have, she started being honest about the faith she was struggling with. Instead of trying to rest in promises that felt distant, she started clinging to the character of the God who made those promises. Her prayers stopped sounding like spiritual performances and started sounding like desperate conversations with someone she trusted but didn't understand. "God, I'm terrified that I'm going to lose my son. I don't understand why he's going through this. I don't understand why our family is walking through this valley. But I know you see him. I know you love him. I know you're not surprised by any of this. Help me hold on to that when everything else feels like it's falling apart." Notice what's happening there. Sarah isn't trying to convince herself that everything is fine. She isn't trying to have faith that her son will definitely get better. She isn't trying to rest in promises about outcomes she can't control. She's anchoring herself to what she knows about God's character, that He sees, that He loves, that He's not caught off guard by their crisis. And from that foundation, she was able to show up for her son in ways that she couldn't when she was consumed by anxiety about things she couldn't control. She could be present in their conversations instead of mentally rehearsing disaster scenarios. She could advocate for his treatment from a place of determination rather than desperation. She could love him well in the midst of his struggle instead of being paralyzed by her fear of losing him. The remarkable thing is, Sarah's son did recover. It took months of treatment, therapy, medication adjustments, and family healing, but he came through that dark season stronger and more connected to his family than he had been before the crisis. But even more remarkable is what Sarah told me when I asked her about the role that resting in God's promises played in their family's healing. She said, "I don't think God healed my son because I learned to trust him better. I think God was always planning to heal my son, but He had to teach me how to be his mom from a place of security rather than from a place of terror. My anxiety wasn't helping him. It was making everything harder for everyone. Learning to rest in God's promises didn't change God's plans for my son. It changed me into the kind of mother my son needed during his recovery. This is what it looks like when you learn to rest in God's promises during the hardest seasons of life. You don't become passive or resigned to whatever happens. You become free to engage with your circumstances from a completely different foundation. You stop wasting energy on things you can't control, which gives you more energy for the things you can control. You stop being driven by fear, which allows you to be guided by wisdom and love. But let me be really honest with you about something. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without resistance. Everything in your nervous system, everything in your cultural conditioning, everything in your past experience might be screaming at you that resting is dangerous, that letting go of control is foolish, that trusting someone else with outcomes is naive. I remember when I first started learning to rest in God's promises during my own season of intense anxiety. Part of me was convinced that if I stopped worrying about things, those things would somehow get worse. Like my anxiety was somehow protecting me from disaster, like my vigilance was keeping bad things from happening to the people I loved. This is what psychologists call magical thinking, and it's incredibly common among people who struggle with anxiety. We develop this unconscious belief that our worry is somehow useful, that our mental rehearsal of worst-case scenarios is somehow preparing us for those scenarios, that our hypervigilance is somehow keeping us safe. But here's what I learned, and what I've seen confirmed in the lives of hundreds of people I've worked with. Anxiety doesn't protect you from bad things happening. It just makes you suffer through them twice, once in your imagination and once in reality if they actually occur. Worry doesn't prevent problems. It just steals your ability to be present for the good things that are happening right now. When you learn to rest, becoming careless or irresponsible, you're becoming in God's promises. You're not free to respond to situations from wisdom rather than from fear. You're becoming available to notice opportunities and resources that anxiety would have blinded you to. You're becoming present to your life instead of living in an anxious parallel universe of what-if scenarios. If you're still here with me after everything we've explored together, I want you to know that means something. It means your heart is ready for the kind of transformation that only comes from resting in promises bigger than your biggest fears. You now have 3 unshakable anchors for your soul. Jesus preparing a place for you, God's care that surpasses even His attention to every bird, and Christ's victory over everything that threatens your peace. These aren't just beautiful concepts anymore. They're your new address, the place where you get to live from now on, regardless of what storms are swirling around you.